Chapter 4. The Golden Cage. The Eternal Tuesday. In the city of Solstice, on Island Prime, it was always 2 p.m. The climate canopy was tuned to a permanent, golden afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look like a vintage postcard. There were no seasons, no storms, and, most importantly, no clocks. For Elias, who had been on the island for 3 weeks, life had become a blurred sequence of high-calorie meals and low-stakes entertainment. He lived in a living module that was essentially a 5-star hotel suite carved from white marble and smart glass. Every morning, the walls would pulse with a soft amber light, and a synthesized voice would ask, "How shall we optimize your joy today, Elias?" This was the core of the Golden Cage, the total removal of friction. In the old world, life was defined by what you had to do. In Arcadia, there was only what you could do, and the options were so vast that they eventually became paralyzing. The buffet of apathy, the great dividend table, was the social heart of Solstice. Thousands of residents gathered there daily. It was a sea of people in leisure silks, the lightweight, breathable tunics provided by Axiom. "Have you tried the bluefin?" a woman named Elena asked Elias as they stood by a fountain of chilled champagne. She had been a bank teller for 40 years before being won by the lottery. Now, she spent her days learning to paint in a VR studio that corrected every brushstroke to make her look like a master. "It's perfect," Elias replied, though he found himself staring at the trash drones that hovered just inches away, waiting for a grape skin to fall. "Everything here is perfect, Elena. That's the problem. Don't you feel thin? Like a ghost in a very expensive museum?" Elena laughed, a sound that felt practiced. "You think too much, Elias. That's why you were redundant back home. Here, thinking is a hobby, not a requirement. Look at the horizon. Have you ever seen water that blue?" Elias looked. The ocean was indeed a perfect, impossible sapphire. But he noticed that no matter how far you walked down the beach, the horizon shaders kept the distance looking exactly the same. You were never getting closer to the edge. You were always in the center of the frame. The erosion of identity. Axiom's management gurus had correctly predicted that without the burden of labor, the human ego would begin to dissolve. To speed this up, the islands utilized identity softening. There were no last names in Solstice. There were no titles. You weren't an engineer or a teacher anymore. You were a guest. If you tried to talk about your old life, the struggles, the debts, the hard-won achievements, the Arrow host would gently steer the conversation back to the present. "The past is a debt you've already paid." The drones would chime if a group started reminiscing about the mainland. "The present is your dividend. Why look at the ledger when the vault is open?" By the second week, most residents stopped talking about home. The mainland was a gray memory of cold winters and unpaid bills. Here, there was only the sun, the silk, and the next scheduled joy event. The leisure-induced decay. Elias began to notice the physical toll of paradise. Because there were no stairs to climb, no heavy bags to carry, and no reason to rush, the people were softening. Their movements became slow and fluid, like creatures living underwater. But it wasn't just physical. It was cognitive. The experience pods provided stories that were perfectly tailored to each user's biases. If you wanted to feel like a hero, the VR gave you a world where you never lost. If you wanted to feel loved, the companion sims gave you a partner who never argued. The residents were being fed into themselves. They were becoming closed loops of self-satisfaction. And in that loop, the Axiom logic found its perfect home. A person who wants for nothing fears nothing. And a person who fears nothing doesn't notice when the people at the neighboring table are replaced by new faces. The quiet absences. Elias started keeping a mental log of the dividend table. He noticed a couple, an elderly man and his wife, who sat near the jasmine trellis every day at Tuesday afternoon. They were wellness evangelists, always talking about how their joints felt younger since arriving. One day, The trellis was empty. He asked a passing aero host, "Where are the Millers?" The couple from the Jasmine table. The drone's eyes flickered a soft, reassuring green. The Millers have been promoted to the Deep Serenity tier on Island 2. Their health metrics reached the optimal threshold for the next phase of the reward. Would you like to see a holographic postcard of their arrival? The drone projected a 3D image of the Millers standing in a garden even more beautiful than this one. They were waving. They looked happy. But Elias, with his analyst's eye, noticed the lighting on the postcard didn't match the atmospheric data of the archipelago. The shadows were pointing the wrong way. It was a generated response. A management-led lie designed to keep the units from feeling the chill of an empty chair. As Elias sat back down, he realized that the golden cage wasn't just about luxury. It was about information deprivation. They were being pampered into a state of sensory blindness. And while they feasted on lab-grown delicacies, the management profits were slowly clearing the table, one guest at a time. The seam in the marble. For the management profits of Axiom, the most dangerous thing on Island Prime wasn't a weapon, it was curiosity. They had designed the island to be an endless loop of satisfaction, a psychological treadmill where every why was answered with a "what would you like to eat?" But Elias was a man built of data, and data requires a source. The Undercity wasn't supposed to exist for the residents. To them, the island was solid ground. But Elias had noticed that the sanitation drones didn't fly to another island to empty their hoppers. They dived into disguised ventilation shafts hidden behind the lush hibiscus bushes of the Grand Promenade. On a night where the artificial sky had been dimmed to a deep, sedative violet, Elias found his entry point. It was a service hatch behind the infinite library, tucked away in a corner where the euphoria frequencies were weakest. Using a sharpened piece of a leisure silk belt and a scavenged magnetic keycard he'd found in a discarded guest's robe, he bypassed the secondary lock. As the hatch hissed open, the smell hit him first. It wasn't the scent of jasmine or roasting wagyu. It was the smell of a computer server room mixed with a chemical plant, hot ozone, sterile bleach, and something metallic that tasted like copper on his tongue. The industrial abyss. Elias dropped into a world of vibrating steel and red emergency lighting. This was the basal layer, the 24/7 engine room of the Arcadia project. Walking along a narrow catwalk, he looked down into a canyon of machinery. Vast, transparent pipes snaked across the ceiling, carrying a thick, pinkish slurry. He followed the pipes, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt since arriving in this frictionless world. He reached a viewing platform overlooking the metabolic processing center. Below him, thousands of robotic arms were moving with a terrifying, insect-like precision. They weren't building luxury cars or printing VR headsets. They were sorting. They were sorting the legacy belongings he had seen in the leak. Mountains of dentures, pacemakers, synthetic hip joints, and millions of those Arcadia gold wristbands. The efficiency of the void. The greed of the management gurus was visible here in its purest, most mechanical form. Axiom hadn't just created a retirement home. They had created a closed-loop bioeconomy. Elias watched as a conveyor belt carried a load of recycled assets, the polite term for the people who had been promoted to Island 2, into a series of molecular disassemblers. In the old world, a layoff meant a loss of income. In Axiom's world, a biological layoff meant a harvest of raw materials. The pink slurry in the pipes wasn't just waste. It was the nutrient base for the next day's buffet. The rare earth minerals from the electronics were being stripped to build more drones. Even the carbon was being sequestered to power the very climate dome that kept the remaining guests in a state of golden apathy. Utility is never lost. A voice echoed from the shadows of the catwalk. It is only transferred. Elias spun around. Standing there was not a guard, but a logistics warden, a human supervisor who had clearly spent too much time in the dark. He looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "You shouldn't be down here," guessed Elias. The warden said, tapping a tablet that displayed Elias's biometric heart rate. "Your stress levels are spiking. It's bad for the yield." The coercion of the truth. "You're feeding us to ourselves," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "The great dividend is just a long-term composting strategy." The warden shrugged, a gesture of profound bureaucratic indifference. The world had 7 billion redundants and a planet with collapsing ecosystems. Axiom found a way to balance the ledger. "We give them the best month of their lives. No work, no pain, total luxury. And in exchange, they provide the resources for the next wave. It's a perfectly sustainable system. It's the ultimate act of corporate social responsibility. It's mass murder," Elias spat. "It's asset reallocation," the warden corrected smoothly. "Murder is loud and messy. This is silent and efficient. We are saving the planet by removing the friction. If you go back upstairs and keep your mouth shut, you can have another 6 months of paradise. We can even deep edit your memory of this conversation. We can make you forget the smell of the copper." The warden leaned in, the red light reflecting in his eyes. "But if you stay here, or if you try to tell the others, well, Island 2 is currently running ahead of schedule. We always have room for a high-friction variable in the disassemblers. The choice in the dark. The threat was absolute. The golden cage wasn't just the luxury above. It was the industrial furnace below. The greed of the system was so total that it didn't even leave room for the dignity of a grave." Elias looked at the warden, then down at the churning vats of the metabolic center. He realized that the management gurus didn't hate the people they were killing. They didn't feel anything for them at all. To Axiom, humanity was just a massive, unorganized inventory that needed to be filed away. "I'll go back," Elias said, his voice hollow. "Wise choice," the warden said, stepping aside. "The arrow host at the hatch will provide a relaxation mist. When you wake up at the buffet tomorrow, the sun will be just as bright, and the peach will taste just as sweet. Enjoy your dividend, Elias. You've earned it." As Elias climbed back toward the marble floors, he felt a new kind of weight. He wasn't going back to paradise. He was going back to a waiting room. But as his hand touched the hatch, he felt the small, hard shape of the magnetic keycard in his pocket. He hadn't just seen the truth. He had stolen a piece of the system's identity. He wasn't going to tell the others. He was going to find a way to break the pipes. The weight of the sun. When Elias emerged from the maintenance hatch, the eternal Tuesday sun felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He walked back into the grand promenade, his leisure silks still smelling faintly of the copper and ozone from the Undercity. The contrast was nauseating. Above, a group of guests were laughing as they participated in a sensory yoga session led by a holographic instructor. They were stretching toward a sky that was actually a high-definition LED array, breathing air that was recycled from the very vats Elias had just seen. The management gurus at Axiom had created the ultimate psychological trap: enforced contentment. How do you start a revolution when everyone around you is being fed their favorite meal? How do you shout fire when the air is perfectly temperature-controlled and smells of lavender? Elias sat at the edge of a marble fountain, watching the water dance. He realized that the greed of the system was more than just financial. It was a greed for total narrative control. They hadn't just taken the people's utility. They had taken their right to be unhappy. To feel grief for the missing was to be unoptimized. And on the island, being unoptimized was the first step toward the transition hub. The mirror in the crowd. For 3 days, Elias played the part of the optimized guest. He ate the lab-grown delicacies, he smiled at the arrow hosts, and he spent hours in the infinite library, ostensibly reading ancient poetry. But his mind was a fever of calculations. He was looking for the static, the people who, like him, seemed to be staring just a little too long at the horizon. He found her at the quiet cove, a secluded part of the beach where the music of the palms was set to a lower decibel. She was a woman in her 60s, named Maya, who had been a structural engineer before the Great Silence. She wasn't swimming or sunbathing. She was drawing diagrams in the sand with a piece of driftwood. Elias sat nearby, watching her. She wasn't drawing landscapes. She was drawing a schematic of the island's thermal vents. "The pressure gradients are wrong," she said, without looking up. Her voice was dry, like parchment. "A city this size, with this much energy output, should be venting more heat into the ocean. Unless the heat is being used for something else. Something endothermic." Elias felt a jolt of electricity. "Like a molecular disassembler," he whispered. Maya stopped drawing. She looked at him, her eyes sharp and terrifyingly sane in this land of the blissful. "So, you've seen the furnace too, data analyst." The Brotherhood of the Aware. They spoke in low tones, their words masked by the rhythmic splashing of the artificial waves. Maya had breached the Undercity months ago, through a different service duct. She had been watching the sunset schedules with the cold eye of an engineer. "They think they've built a perfect loop," Maya said, her finger tracing a line in the sand that represented the island's central power core. "But Vance and his prophets are arrogant. They believe that because they've automated our survival, they've also automated our souls. They've turned us into inventory, but inventory can be volatile." "What can we do?" Elias asked, his heart racing. "The warden saw me. They can recycle us whenever they want." "They won't," Maya replied, a grim smile touching her lips. "Not yet. The system hates unscheduled anomalies. If they recycle us too quickly, it creates a ripple in the data that the other guests might sense. They need us to fade naturally. We have time, but not much. The next great promotion is in 4 days. It's a big one. 10,000 units. The crack in the spreadsheet." Maya revealed her discovery. The white noise envelope, the electromagnetic shield that blocked all outbound signals, was powered by the same grid as the resource recycling center. When the incinerators hit peak capacity during a promotion, the power draw was so massive that the shield had to pulse cycle to prevent a total blowout. "It's a 0.04-second window," Maya said. Axiom calls it operational overhead. To them, it's a rounding error. To us, it's a door. The greed for efficiency had created a flaw. To save a fraction of a percent in energy costs, the management gurus had left a micro fissure in their fortress. "We don't just need to send a message," Elias said, thinking of the technician Kovic and the 3-second leak. "We need to send a protocol. We need to show the mainland how to crash the Axiom gateway from the outside." The last sunset. As the eternal Tuesday sun began to dim into the violet evening, Elias and Maya stood together on the pier. Around them, the other guests were heading toward the nightly gala, their faces glowing with artificial health and borrowed joy. They looked like a sea of golden ghosts, drifting toward their own erasure. "Vance thinks he's optimized humanity out of the equation," Elias whispered. "He forgot one thing," Maya replied, looking at the dark silhouette of the Undercity chimneys. "You can't lay off the truth. It's the only asset that doesn't depreciate." They walked back toward the lights of the city, two legacy assets who had decided to become a virus in the system. The golden cage was still beautiful, and the food was still free, but the management profits in their Alpine boardrooms were about to learn that even the most perfect spreadsheet can be ruined by a single, defiant human variable.